Tonight we are going to do our webinar on not just soil testing and maybe why you should soil test, but how to take a good soil sample, like a really good quality soil sample. So when you do send it to a soil lab for analysis, you get good results. Because if you start with a good soil sample, you're much more likely to get good results that'll help you understand what is and isn't in your soil, and then how you respond to those results with actions that you take on your farm. Every soil is different, and every soil test result is going to be different that you send in, as you do that every few years or every year or in a different field. So taking time to get a good sample and knowing how to do that, as well as knowing how to understand what that report means, and what the different things being tested mean and why they're tested, can really go a long way in making sure that the soil is your number one resource on the land that you take care of, regardless of what you're growing or raising on that land. So what I want to accomplish today is to kind of just go through that process from making the decision to have your soil tested to the things you have to do along the way. I will say that I applaud you for being here and for listening to the webinar and the recording, because of all the things we do on the farm and with the land, the soil sometimes gets forgotten as a resource. It's not as exciting as the plants or animals for a lot of people, but it holds all the energy. You know, if the soil is healthy and full of energy, so is everything else, including us. So taking the time to appreciate and understand it is a very, very important thing to do. And I say that as someone who remembers dreading having to take a soils class and putting it off until my very last year of college. And even at that point, not really appreciating it. And years later now, saying, wow, I kind of missed an opportunity to learn so much more. And now really do take the time to notice the soil wherever I am and appreciate it. So my name's Denise Natoli Brooks. I am the Southeast Ohio Agriculture and Natural Resource Educator. I do have a small piece of land that I take care of, and it's been really quite interesting watching it for the past 7 years as I have cultivated it, to see how it's changed and grown. I was fortunate to already have soil that had a lot of life in it and was quite healthy. But observing how my choices have at times helped and sometimes honestly hurt the soil too, and learning along the way and building those skills to make sure that I am prioritizing the soil. And I'll tell you, even right now, it's spring, it's planting season. I haven't actually gotten to the planting part yet for the annual produce, but I was looking at the beds just over the past week, and I had a lot more cover, like just straw and manure and inputs on top of some lower beds in the space that I cultivate compared to the upper beds. It actually all started out the same, but stuff moves. Excuse me. Those upper beds, they're not looking as good as the lower beds. They just don't have as much nutrients going into them, organic matter going into them, and I can tell just from when I put stuff on the beds at the end of the growing season to now. So I'm coming up with a plan of how do I really build up these beds that I neglected by accident, but I neglected. Now, have I tested the soil to compare that upper portion to a lower portion of the property just at this moment in time? No, my visual observance is what I'm talking about. But it is something that I take the time to look at and observe. So step one to me really is taking time to look at the soil. When you need to dig in it at all, when you're covering it, when you're uncovering it, when you're planting, all of that. So it's worth taking the time. So what I put together tonight is a presentation. I did use PowerPoint, but I'm going to warn you, most of the slides have pictures of soil test results, because that's what we're really going to look at, is what the results are. But I'm also going to try to show a video of how to collect a good quality soil sample as well. We're just a small group. If something comes up and you have a question or a comment, please unmute yourself. That's just fine, and speak up. No worries if you interrupt me. I am not offended. All right, I see, Vanessa, you're logged in on 2 devices now, it looks like, but I see you both on there. And then when you're not, you know, wanting to discuss or comment, if you do keep those mics muted, that helps a lot with interference. But I'm going to go ahead and right now share my screen so you can see what I've got to start out in the presentation. And what I would like to do is start this little slideshow for you. So what I've got going on in my presentation that I really wanted to make sure we cover is taking that sample, how to read the results, and the action steps. The taking the sample is as involved as you want it to be, but if you take more time to take the sample, you end up with better results. And that's really the key. So if you have a lot of space, you would take more soil samples, and that takes more time, but you want to get a good feel for what you've got in your space. If you have one small garden bed, I would say that you could get away with taking a soil sample in that small space. But really, if you take more than one sample and mix those soils together and then send off a composite, if you will, to the soil lab, you still will get better results than if you take just one single sample, because one sample is a snapshot. If you take multiple samples and mix them together and create that composite, it gives you that overall look. Also, if you know you've got a problem or you see a difference in how your plants are growing, separate out those soil samples so you understand in the problem areas what the deficiency is, so it doesn't get mixed up with everything else, but you really get to highlight that special area that you're like, something's not right here. I don't know what it is. I'd love a soil test to tell me what might be missing. You can always do a soil test on a specific area if it's a problem area. So what I am going to try to do, and I'm going to highlight the try to do, is I did a video outside doing a soil sample, which is much more real than me trying to talk you through using the tools to take a soil sample. But this tool that's in that picture, that's a probe, a soil probe. It's hollow in the center, and it's something you can usually borrow from a local extension office or a soil and water conservation district to take a soil sample pretty easily. But you can also use a shovel to take a soil sample, or a trowel, a small shovel, hand shovel, to take a soil sample too. The shovel gets really tiring if you have to take a lot of samples, and sometimes the soil probe just makes it easier. The pictured probe is a shorter probe, so you're still leaning over using your back quite a bit. There are taller ones that are out there too. And then the bucket's the other tool, because you need something to put the soil in. But overall, pretty simple process. So what I want to try is to show you this video on my computer, and bear with me, I have not shown this before through the webinar, so thanks for piloting it with me. I appreciate it. I just exited the slideshow for you so we can open this video. But the key that I wanted to highlight with the soil test is we want to test the soil. The soil is underneath often the plants that are growing on top of the soil, so that whether it's a a straw cover that you have, like in the picture, or if you have a forage, a pasture, a cover crop, plants growing in the growing season, regardless of what you have growing, that's not what you want to highlight in your soil sample, because that's the plants. That's what you move out of the way to take your soil sample, or you remove from the soil sample before you send it into the lab. So when you are looking at the soil, especially if it's produce we're talking about, generally most of the roots that are pulling up nutrients from the soil and benefiting from the organic matter, that's in the upper part of the soil. So you don't actually need to go very deep. A lot of activity, root activities in those 4 to 6 inches. You definitely don't need to go past 8 inches. But when you're testing soil, think about what crops do I want to grow here and what are their roots like? If you grow a crop with very shallow roots, that's the area of the soil you want to test. If you're growing a crop with much deeper roots, you would test deeper. And so we want to think about not just what's in my soil, but what am I going to grow? And I will test my soil based on those types of things, keeping that in mind. So often if we're looking at a forest system, deeper roots and trees, you might be testing deeper in the soil, right? I mean, obviously big trees, big roots, deeper soil tests. Whereas most of our produce, we're looking at the 4 to 6 inches, no more than 8. Vanessa, I see you have a hand up, so feel free to share what your comment or question is.
Thank you so much for this class, by the way. We are planting trees, and the holes are dug for the trees, and so they're fruiting trees. They're still small now, but I just actually did, right before this class, my soil sample, and I took a sample from the bottom of the hole, which I know is very deep. It's definitely like probably a foot, if not a foot and a half. And then, but I also went around the rest of the yard in like a zigzag pattern, and I took soil samples from the 6-inch range as well. But I made sure to sample both holes for the trees. And then lastly, unfortunately, I wasn't the one who dug the holes, and the soil that was in the hole was removed. And so I've replaced it with compost manure mix and chicken manure. So you may have to table some of those questions for later, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. Well, exciting that you're planting trees, and great that you're thinking ahead of what's going on deeper in the soil. Because even if you have that hole dug, that tree will eventually be in the soil that's not disturbed too as its roots expand. So those tests or samples you took that were deeper, those are specific depths, and when you do your analysis or send your soil for analysis, you'll want that soil depth separate, because you want to know what's in my soil at the 12 to 18 inch depth, specifically, because it will be different than what's at the 6-inch depth. It should be different, because there are often more nutrients and definitely more organic matter or at the top of the soil, earlier in that test that you're doing. And then deeper, you expect to see a difference. So keep that sample of the deeper soil separate when you have it analyzed. And you can do a test up to like the 24-inch depth as well, depending on what you want to look for. But it's kind of that once you get to that 12 inch, 12 to 18 inches, 18 to 24 inches, you want to kind of just keep those chunks in their own sample, because you're going to get a better understanding of that soil profile, what's in it with the results. And then you can still, as long as the soils appear to be similar, you can mix your 2 samples from the deeper soil together and do one test on it. That's okay. But it's still at the same depth, and that information is going to be filled out when you send your sample in to be analyzed. So the folks testing it know this is not the soil surface, this is the subsurface that I'm testing, or in most cases, the majority of the tests that they're doing do tend to be at the surface, because that will impact not just results, but can even impact the tests that are being done, how they're being done, the analysis. So good that you're taking both of those. I think that'll help you. Now, it's okay that the soil that was in the hole is not there. Whatever you're putting in, you're feeding that tree, taking good care of it. It sounds like you're thinking about that with the compost and manure. We just want to make sure that that is not too rich for that new tree as well. So if you can do some mixing, but especially deeper in the, because if you've dug, you said about 2 feet, pretty deep hole, you know, there generally wouldn't be a lot of organic material down in that deep hole anyway. So maybe try to mix some of the soil that's around in that deep hole with your compost. So you're diluting it essentially. But good luck with the trees. It's always exciting to get some new stuff planted.
Yeah, they're fruit trees, and I'm just wondering which sample I should send in, because I can just sample the top layer and send it in. Or if, I mean, I know it'd be ideal if I could sample both, but unfortunately I have one sample that I can do. So what do you think is more important for a fruit tree? I live in an urban area, and the other soil samples have come back with lead in them. So that's my concern.
Okay. So are you going to pay for the additional lead test or heavy metals test in this one sample you're sending off?
Yes.
Okay, so here's an idea. The heavy metals test is more expensive than your basic test. Would you consider doing one of your analysis, like it doesn't matter which one, but I would say that the top 6 inches, test that one and pay for the heavy metal test? Send in the deeper test, but don't do the heavy metal test on that one. Because that additional test without heavy metals doesn't actually, it's not that much of an additional fee. That could be a possibility, but I would test the surface. If you're going to pay for heavy metal testing, do it on the surface, because that's what you're interacting with.
Got you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Yes, definitely. But I am glad to hear too, in urban areas or any area you don't know the history of, we do have to consider some of the heavy metal tests. Lots of our urban farming sites, we want to consider those heavy metal tests. And it is an additional fee, but we're talking heavy metals, right? Sometimes we got to pay that extra money to keep us safe and make sure that us working in the soil, we're safe, and the food that we're growing is safe too. That is not a standard test, but it is 100% available to us through the soil labs. You have to request it, but yes, very, very important to consider. A place that I am working right now, a new urban site that I'm working on right now, we are definitely doing a heavy metals test on that property, because it is right in a town, and an old city. So we just don't know what's there. All right. The soil sample process, when you're taking that, essentially that strip of soil, it's not a massive amount that you're taking, but you need those inches, that profile of soil. When you do collect a few different samples and put them in the bucket, do take the time to remove big roots. You can remove the rocks, break apart the chunks of soil, mix it up. You might even need to let it dry a little bit if it's really wet, before you send it in, because the soil sample bag is not very big. The sample that's needed for the lab to test your soil is not very big. So you see the picture of the soil sample bag on the screen. That's the one that's used by the lab, called Spectrum Analytics. That's one of the Ohio soil sample labs, but I'll hold their bag up kind of like in front of my face so you see the real size of it. It's not very big, and the line right here to the bottom of the bag, that's what you have to fill with soil. That's not much soil that they need to test your soil, right? So you might collect many samples and mix it up, but what you actually put into the bag that goes to the lab is a small amount. So I did want to make sure to point that out. You're not pulling out scoops and scoops of soil. It's just a little bit. And when you send in information into the lab to say what you want tested, they're going to want to know what you're growing. Some of that categories are very specific and some are general. So for this example, vegetable garden, that's pretty general. That could include a lot of different things, right? But one of the sites, because there were 6 sites on this sample, one of the sites was being tested for bell pepper specifically, and one was being tested specifically for sweet corn, right? So you can get really specific on some of these, or you can go general. If you have a lot of different produce growing in a space, just go with vegetable garden. That's sufficient. The lab will also want to know how much of this item you're growing, because that will help them determine what the recommendation is to add as a fertilizer to build up the soil health. And then also how big an area you're growing and how much you want to ultimately harvest. Some folks might be really pushing to harvest as much sweet corn as possible. So they really want to add fertility to the land to get as much corn. Others may not be pushing for that same high yield level. So that's why those questions are asked when you fill out the information, and then that you want to take the time to give the lab as much information as possible. Because again, the more information you give them, the better the result you get back from them. That's really the big point on that. The results are, when you get the result sheet, you're just like, oh my gosh, there's all these numbers. What in the world? Like, what does it mean? I need a whole book to explain what this means. You don't have to necessarily, quite honestly, know what every single number means, but there are a few things that are helpful that just kind of help break down a few things to say, okay, I know that this parameter needs to be in between this range. Is it yes or no? Those are the kind of indicators. So I broke this result sheet, which this is a real result sheet for an urban farming site. And I broke it down to zoom into a few sites. Every place that you sample or site that you're planting that you send in needs to have an identifier. It can be a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's fine. But pick something that's easy for you to know what it is. So the person who put this one together named the gardens. I am going to guess that the 1BG Three Sisters garden literally was growing the Three Sisters, the beans, the squash, the corn. But it was named so it's easy to know where the soil sample came from. Zoom in a little bit, and across the top where the red arrow is, I highlighted pH as a parameter that of all the things to really pay attention to in your site is that soil pH, because if your soil is too acidic, too basic, you're going to have trouble successfully growing. So pH usually comes back as what the actual pH is on the scale up to 14, but you're actually looking for around 6.8 plus or minus about 0.5-ish. So in that 6.3 to 7.3, that's kind of where you're looking, but sometimes there's going to be an additional score called the buffer pH, which is an additional test done. And that one is more to get a little bit more information out of your soil sample. And if the results of your soil test show that your pH is too low, the recommendation from the soil lab will be to add lime to increase pH. And when you do that, you actually look at the buffer pH score to figure out how much lime to raise that pH for. But really, pH, looking at this, those pHs look good on this soil sample. The 7.3 is a little high, but everything else honestly is fine. And even that 7.3, it's nothing to really worry about at this point. But that's the reason why that one is so important, is because pH determines how well all the nutrients, the macronutrients and the micronutrients, can be taken up by the soil. So if your pH is close to neutral, which is 7, and I said 6.8 is what we're looking for, your soil can take up the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potassium, the big macronutrients. It can also take up all the other micronutrients, like the calcium and magnesium. And if the pH goes too far in either direction, it starts to not be able to take up some of those nutrients. And some of the nutrients are actually super duper sensitive. So for example, on this slide, if you look at phosphorus, if your pH goes low, goes down, right, your phosphorus uptake goes down pretty quickly too. And same if your pH goes high. Or if you look at iron, which is a micronutrient, if your pH gets high, right? So we said that one had 7.3. The plants are going to have trouble taking up the iron in the soil, a harder time than if it was at that the middle, the 6.8. So the pH is so important, because if it's not in the right place, the nutrients aren't being taken up. So if you pay attention to anything on the results, start with the pH. I also really like to look at organic matter in the results and look at that quickly, because it is shown as a percentage on the results. So percent organic matter in that soil sample. A lot of the organic matter is closer to the surface, and the soil biology, the microbes, they can function better with more organic matter. So a higher percentage is going to mean that your soil overall is functioning well. That system, that ecosystem is functioning well. So if we look at the results here, that same soil that had a 7.3 pH is also the soil with the lowest organic matter. And you start to see some trends as you go through these different sites. Is 3.8 bad? It's not. It's not. But can we increase it? Sure, we can look at, okay, well, the rest of the gardens at this site have a higher organic matter. Why is this one lower, and what can we do to increase it? Organic matter in the soil is going to break down, because that's what it does. It's carbon-based. And as it breaks down, it releases nutrients into the soil. So if you have more organic matter, you essentially have more natural fertilizer, because it's releasing nutrients into the soil. So each 1% of organic matter, right, 1% of organic matter can release 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre, right? Nitrogen, that's one of the big fertilizers, nutrients that we add. The organic matter, 1%, can release 4 to 7 pounds of phosphorus. So P, right? So N and P. And then sulfur, a micronutrient, 2 to 3 pounds of sulfur can be released through the organic matter, every 1% organic matter. So when we look at the first site on these results, the 1BG upper site, 5.4% organic matter. And what did I say? 20 to 30 pounds nitrogen per acre for every 1%. So that's over 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre that could be released, because there's over 5% organic matter. Those are nutrients, fertilizers that you don't have to purchase. So pretty interesting to look at those numbers too. I'm just moving along to the next column, the phosphorus column. So P, one of the major macronutrients. There are a few different tests that are used in measuring the amount of phosphorus, and the test that's used is dependent on how your pH is. So above a 7 or below a 7 pH depends on, or determines, the tests that are used. Do we really need to know that? Probably not, but the labs are going to look at your pH to determine then how to test for the phosphorus in the soil, and they may even test in some detail to tell you not only how much phosphorus you have total, but how much you have available, like how much the plants can access currently, and then how much, or kind of your like reserve, if you will. That's like it's not available, but it's in the soil already. It's kind of your reserve. So that's what they're going to look at, what you have now, and then in the recommendations, it'll tell you if they say, oh, you should add more or not, based on those numbers. So again, that same garden that had the higher pH, the lower organic matter, it also has much lower phosphorus, right? So, you know, every time those three things we've talked about so far say, if we're going to put some effort into one site of these 6, it's going to be that BG Bizinnia. That 5th one down is the one that just keeps coming up, but something's not in great shape for it. And we wouldn't know without this soil test. The potassium, another major nutrient there, the potassium is in we're looking for a range of potassium of around 200 parts per million. And I should have mentioned that for the phosphorus too, measuring it in parts per million. So a range around 200 parts per million is ideal. And then if it's lower, we're likely going to have a recommendation to add potassium to the soil. So we can say, oh, wow, look at that. The third garden, the 1BG, 3 sisters, 241 potassium. We definitely don't have to add anything there. That's extra. No worries. But as we get to the other ones, and again, that 5th garden down, the problem one, it has low potassium too, that we're seeing there. And then the magnesium is actually a micronutrient, and it is very rarely limiting. It's very rarely like a problem in the soil. You can have too much of it. Like if you have 600 parts per million, that is too much. That would be a problem. You would actually have a recommendation to add something like gypsum to bring down the magnesium if it ended up being really high. But very rarely is that one that's going to come up on your test as a problem. And the calcium, what we're looking for in calcium, about 2,000 parts per million. So for these sites, their calcium is just fine. They have enough, they have more than enough on there. Even the problem site has more than enough, but 2,000 parts per million is what we're looking for. If the calcium was low, the recommendation to increase it, if you're not using organic matter to increase it, some kind of organic matter would be lime, bringing it up. And then the last one on here is the one where like we try to remember chemistry class, and you're like CEC, cation exchange capacity. It can be a very confusing concept, but a way to like think about it as CEC, cation exchange capacity. So things like the calcium and magnesium, those are cations. They're just positively charged ions. So positively charged ions exchange capacity. So it's kind of how much your soil can hold of these cations. How much calcium can it hold? How much magnesium can it hold? It's looking at actually measuring the amount of clay. It looks at the amount of clay in the soil and the amount of organic material and even the type of clay in the soil, and says how much can this soil hold on to those positively charged ions or cations. So if you increase your organic matter, you increase your cation exchange capacity. More organic matter, the soil can hold on to that calcium and that magnesium better. It can hold on to the potassium better. So again, organic material, organic matter keeps the soil healthier. It also can tell you the cation exchange capacity that you don't want to over apply nutrients to, because if the soil can only hold a certain amount of nutrients and you add more, you're wasting your time and money because the soil can't hold on to it. It gets washed away. Not only does it get washed away, but when we wash away those nutrients, we're just adding pollution to the water in our communities. So looking at that cation exchange capacity, how much the soil can hold or tie up the nutrients in the soil. Generally, when you look at the numbers, the lower the cation exchange capacity number, you have less clay in the soil and you tend to have more sand in the soil. And if you have more sand in the soil, that means your soil tends to hold less water, drains fast. So perhaps this garden on our results here that's called BG Basinia, with its lower cation exchange capacity, maybe that site has more sand in it because that's something the cation exchange capacity lower number is indicating at that 12.6. That's a possibility. Maybe it's draining faster. So it would make you really want to go to that site again and really kind of literally dig in the soil a bit, feel the soil. Like, is it feeling grittier than the other soil? Like it has more sand? But even this cation exchange capacity is showing us some clues that the soil texture might even be different there. And on the flip side, if your cation exchange capacity is high, and it looks like our highest one on this sample is 21.2, you likely have more clay in that soil, and the clay actually can hold on to nutrients better. So interesting things just through there. The other thing on the soil results that I wanted to highlight, and the kind of the last piece I really wanted to highlight, is something called base saturation. Base saturation. It's a ratio. And it's kind of looking at a ratio comparison of your potassium, your magnesium, your calcium, hydrogen, and even sodium. And so what you see on the base saturation here, they're highlighting K, which is potassium, Mg, magnesium, and Ca, calcium. And their percentages. What we're looking for the K, the potassium percentage, we are looking for between 3 and 8, more like 3 and 6 is even better. So our potassium at these sites is all a little bit low. Base saturation. The potassium is looking a little bit low. Could that be just something in that site overall? But it looks like, if anything, based on the base saturation, we might have a recommendation to add, to bring up the potassium. The magnesium, what we're looking for is more 12 to 15%. And it looks like we're in a good shape. It looks like the magnesium's a little high in just one of the gardens, but a little bit high is okay. That's better than a little bit low. So 12 to 15% magnesium is what we're looking for. But you know what? When soils get to be high in magnesium, it sometimes indicates a heavy clay soil. So that 17.8 on the upper garden, maybe that has a bit more clay in it, that we could look at that closer. And then the calcium percentage, we're looking 65 to 75 is ideal, which looks like we're in good shape, except that BG Basinia garden has a lot of calcium in it, which is interesting. And honestly, I don't know why. That's something I'd want to look at closer to figure out. So overall, as we looked at all of the different parameters, you know, I'm looking at the soil test results with you here, one garden stood out. That's the one that I would say, if we're going to put a lot of focus into fixing a garden or making it a better site, healthier soil, that's the one we want to put our effort into, because something's off. We could really do a lot to work on that one. We might see the production of whatever we're growing be lower because it's not at that healthy level. So that's the one that I would focus on, but I wouldn't ignore the others either. And that's where you take your results and then you look at the recommendations that the lab sets, because the the lab also will give you recommendations of what they think you would benefit from adding as a nutrient to each of the sites that you have sampled. They're giving you that information in pounds per acre. So for a small scale, we'd have to do some conversions because we're often not growing acres of a certain crop. Especially at the urban sites, we have to do some math to get those smaller amounts that are the right fertilizer. So when we look at that garden, the fifth one, the BG by Zinnia, right? It has recommendations to add nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, boron, and manganese, a bunch of different things on there. And you're like, whoa, that's a lot of stuff too. 161 pounds per acre of potassium, and potassium was low. That sounds like a lot. But if it's a small space, that's not a huge amount. You just have to adjust it. But these are really good recommendations, and you can figure out what you might need for that. I'll note that the third garden, called Three Sisters, they were growing corn there. Corn uses a lot of nitrogen. It takes up a lot of nitrogen. So even if our nitrogen levels on our soil test said it was in a good place, the recommendations are going to take into account what you're growing and what those crops use, and say, you might have enough nitrogen right now, but once you grow that corn, it's going to take up so much nitrogen. Go ahead and add more nitrogen now, because you're going to need it after that corn takes it up. So it's helping you plan ahead as well. It's not just saying, this is what you have right now, do this now. It's looking at what you're growing too. So that goes back to how important it is to tell the lab what you're growing, because they'll give you recommendations keeping in mind certain crops take up more of certain nutrients. Just like if you were growing a bunch of peas or beans, those are legumes, they're fixing nitrogen, they're adding nitrogen into the soil. They would take that into account as well. And that's why often peas or beans follow corn, because it's replacing the nitrogen in just a natural system. But there's so much information that comes out of these soil test results. It can seem overwhelming, but you kind of just take the time to break it down, to see to know the parameters, the general parameters, so you can pick out, ooh, that's off, right? And really then decide where you want to put your efforts. Also, do keep in mind on our small scale spaces that we do have to do some conversions to get the smaller amounts of nutrients for the small spaces, because pounds per acre it's designed for big fields. It just is. So sometimes you got to downsize it to fit the smaller spaces. The Extension service is here to help you with your soil test results. I just shared a lot of information with you, but guess what? It's not all up here. I have my resources too that tell me what all the parameters are to help me interpret soil test results. So know that the Central State Extension Ag and Natural Resource educators can help walk you through your soil test results to make sense of them, and consider a plan for how to improve the soil at your site, because it really does all start with the soil. It does. And taking the time to build up the soil and care for it in the long run really pays off, because you have better produce, you have more produce. You get to eat delicious food, and so do your customers that get to eat the food too. So this is actually just the first soil focused webinar in the third Thursday series that we have this summer. The next webinar is the 16th of June. We're going to look at the USDA's web soil survey that can really give you an overview of the soil characteristics without ever even having to dig or take a soil test. Amazing online tool. We're also going to look at another brand new soil tool called the Soil Matrix, and that is the 21st of July. That one actually takes not just the soil into account, but different practices. Like I want to add cover crops to my space that I grow in. How does that improve my soil? And it gives you a score. So you kind of evaluate your soil now, and you evaluate your soil after you do this, this, and this, or stop doing this, this, and this, and get a score. So some interesting online free tools we're going to dig into a little more, and then we'll move on to more of a pest management through August, September, and October, because everybody who tries to grow anything knows that we got to manage pests as well, right? So couple minutes. I'm open to questions if you have any. And I thank you for taking the time to learn about how to really consider those soil tests and results.
Hi, yes, sorry. I thank you so much for that information of Denise's so that I'll turn my camera on. So I don't know if you can see me. There we go. I will definitely do that. But real quick, I was looking at the sample that I received. Actually, it's from Spectrum Analytics. It looks a lot different than the one that you had. I don't see that. I don't know if you could go back to the other screen, but it was the general overview, like I can't remember the word that you were using for it, but it looks totally different than the one that you were looking at. The thing I noticed is that all of my numbers are actually really good, except for the potassium is low. It's 83. Yeah, so thank you so much. You were going through the base saturation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't have that on mine at all. And then the recommendations, it says nutrients expressed in broadcast IBS/A, except for Fe, which is iron, and it says foliar, and Mn, which is magnesium, and then it says Rho. So I will definitely call Denise or maybe take a picture and email it to her so she can look at this with me as well. But it's a little bit confusing just because it really does look so different.
Yeah, I would be happy to look at it, and it might be just a matter of what test you selected from Spectrum 2, because you said yours was more tree focused, right?
So this was before I had planted the trees, and I did a general. This one was a different area, and I did a general sample that was recommended, and then I also did the heavy metals as well, because I know that in the area that I live, they bury the houses underground. So that means that we're going to have high levels of contaminants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So yeah, I would be happy to take a look at the test you have. It sounds like you, with the basic one that gets you started, it just shows some of your information. And then what I brought up was one that looked for some really specific stuff for growing certain crops. The labs do so many different things, but yeah, I'd be happy to take a look and of what got tested. There is generally, as your parts per million are higher, for the things tested in base saturation, your base saturation is higher too. So like if your calcium you said was low, the base saturation calcium
It's
potassium.
Potassium. The calcium is actually it's 2,621, and the optimal is 2,000 to 2,700. You know what? It's really hard for you to not see it, so maybe I'll just email you a picture of it.
Please do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Yes, and that is why I do point out something that the extension educators can do, and even some water conservation districts, is to sit down and really tease out the results. Because the results are great, but they're not presented in a way that's the easiest to really understand. It takes time to interpret it. So yeah, we're here to help you.
Thank you.